23 years ago, Death Penalty Focus co-sponsored with the Center on Wrongful Convictions in Chicago an event that introduced to the public 37 men who had been sentenced to death and freed because they were innocent, exonerated. It was a thunderclap. It really created a lot of noise and began to raise questions in people's minds about our system. One of those exonerees is a man named Walter McMillan. He was there accompanied by his attorney, Bryan Stevenson. Their story was told in the book, Bryan's book, Just Mercy, and the motion picture just out last year. Both fabulous stories, important stories. Bryan was not well known at the time, but since that time he has become embraced by the entire country and the criminal justice defense community as one of the stars of this system. He was part, in fact, with seeing to it that the Supreme Court outlawed the death penalty for those under 18 years of age when a crime is committed, and also life without parole. But Bryan's not only interested in the law, he's a healer. He really wants our society to come together. He's trying to find ways to communicate that need for reconciliation. He formed in Montgomery, Alabama, where he lives and works, the National Memorial for Peace and Justice and the Legacy Museum that honors victims of lynching, an extraordinary place. Bryan's work is for human healing, for coming together, for finding ways that we as people can be brothers and sisters rather than enemies and or afraid of each other. Because I don't want to just list Bryan's accomplishments, I'd like to tell you some of what he thinks. Let me read this statement that he made in an interview. I'm persuaded that hopelessness is the enemy of justice. That if we allow ourselves to become hopeless, we become part of the problem. I think you're either hopeful or you're the problem. There's no neutral place. We've been dealing with injustice in so many places for so long, and if you try to dissect why this is still here, it's because people haven't had enough hope and confidence to believe that we can do something better. I think hope is our superpower. Hope is the thing that gets you to stand up when people say sit down. It's the thing that gets you to speak when others say be quiet. Bryan is a man who stands up and speaks. Some of us work to bring a little light to the world. Bryan is the light. So it's my pleasure to present him with the Rose Elizabeth Byrd Commitment to Justice Award for Death Penalty Focus. I love you, Bryan.
Thank you so much. It is such a great honor to receive this award from the Death Penalty Focus. I've known this amazing organization, worked with, been inspired by the work of this extraordinary coalition of people for many, many years. And Mike Farrell and I used to go around to parts of the country advocating to end the death penalty, testifying, making arguments, and it's a real thrill and honor to receive recognition from Death Penalty Focus, given your extraordinary work. I also want to congratulate the other award winners. I've known Mike Radelet for over 30 years, and his work has been critical to building the knowledge needed to end the death penalty in this country. I'm so thrilled that you're honoring my friend, Rabbi Sharon Brous, who I've gotten to know and love. She came to be with us when we opened our sites in Montgomery in 2018. We've had the opportunity to share and present together, and I'm just thrilled that she's being recognized. And of course, the amazing cast and writers of Clemency. What a talented director, incredibly gifted writer. And then my friend Alfre Woodard, who gave such an amazing performance. Clemency is a powerful film that tells a powerful story about why the death penalty is so destructive in this country. I've often argued that the question of capital punishment in America can't be resolved by asking the question, do people deserve to die for the crimes they've committed? The threshold question is, do we deserve to kill? And it's become clearer and clearer that we live in a nation so compromised by unfairness, so compromised by the legacy of slavery and bigotry, that no one should be confused about the fact that we don't deserve to kill. It's not just the fact that we have a criminal justice system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty than if you're poor and innocent. It's not just the fact that we've elected prosecutors across this country that use the death penalty as a political tool for power and have undermined fairness and integrity, but it's also this long history of racial injustice that has made it impossible for this nation to credibly claim that it deserves to kill. We are living at a time when the history of racial injustice has so clearly manifested itself. We're not free in America. We're all burdened by this legacy of injustice and inequality. We are in a post-genocide society. What Europeans did when they got to this continent, the genocide that took place against indigenous people, is something we haven't acknowledged. The narrative of racial difference that we created in America to justify the displacement of Native folks, the lies we told ourselves about Native people. We said, oh no, they're different. They're savages. That narrative of racial difference that insulated them from protection by this Constitution created an America that was compromised, that was contaminated, that was corrupted by bigotry. And it was that narrative of racial difference that allowed us to get comfortable with 2.5 centuries of slavery. And the great evil of American slavery wasn't involuntary servitude and forced labor. The true evil of American slavery was the idea that black people aren't as good as white people. This ideology of white supremacy that meant that black people aren't as valuable, aren't as worthy, aren't as capable. That narrative of racial difference, that ideology of white supremacy, that was the true evil of American slavery. And we fought the Civil War, and the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war, and that idea of racial hierarchy persisted. It's why I've argued that slavery doesn't end in 1865. It just evolved, and it gave rise to the precursor of the American death penalty, the modern death penalty, a century of lynching. And the violence that took place on courthouse lawns, the violence that took place in the public square, where black people were pulled out of their homes and tortured and traumatized and terrorized and then lynched, burned to death. That narrative, that legacy is what gave rise to the modern death penalty. After a half century where black people were tormented and terrorized, where 6 million black people fled the American South and went to Cleveland and Chicago and Los Angeles and Oakland and Detroit and Minneapolis, not as immigrants, but as refugees and exiles from terror. After all of that, the politics of lynching and spectacle violence became too much for this country to reconcile with its rhetoric around justice and equality. And so the lynchings went indoors. We created indoor proceedings that were no more reliable, no more just, no more fair than those outdoor lynchings. And that's what gave rise to the modern death penalty. And many of us have been fighting that death penalty for decades. We have made incredible progress, that there's a moratorium in California, that states have abolished the death penalty over the last decade, that we've seen some of the lowest numbers of death sentences and executions over the last few years, is a testament to the great work of so many of you, including Death Penalty Focus. But we should also be mindful that this is a critical moment in our nation's history. We now have a U.S. Supreme Court that is hostile to protecting the rights of condemned prisoners. We've seen this outbreak of executions by the United States government. It is a forewarning of what will come. I'm very concerned that in 2021, when people get execution dates, they will be executed, that there will be more torture, more terror, more trauma, more heartbreak in this fight to end capital punishment. So this is a moment for coming together and committing to continuing this work. We are not near the finish line yet. We're making progress, but we're not there yet. But this is also a moment to collect all of the resources that are available to us. I've been in Montgomery for the last year. The pandemic has given me the opportunity to stay close to home. And it's been challenging, but it's also been affirming, because living as I have every day in Montgomery has given me an opportunity to reflect on the generation that came before me. I stand on the shoulders of people who did so much more with so much less. And I think about what they did. They did so much more with so much less. I think about the fact that the generation before me would put on their Sunday best and they would go places and they would kneel and pray for justice, pray for fair treatment. And in response to their prayers, they'd get beaten and bloodied and battered. And yet they continued to advocate. They continued to fight. And because they fought, we must fight. I have a new relationship to the soundtrack of justice advocacy to the instinct to sing, we shall overcome, even when we're facing so much challenge and adversity. Being in Montgomery has caused me to reflect on my own story. My great-grandparents were enslaved in Virginia during enslavement, and yet my great-grandfather learned to read because he had this hope that justice would one day come. It wasn't rational to a lot of people, but it was live and it was powerful, and it motivated him to read. And when emancipation came, the formerly enslaved people would come to his house, and my grandmother told me they'd listen to him read the newspaper every night, and it was so empowering to them, and her, to have that. And because of that hope of justice, she learned to read, and she gave that desire to my mother, and she gave it to me. And we were poor, but my mom went into debt to buy the World Book Encyclopedia because she wanted us to see a world that went beyond the racially segregated community where I was born. And it is that instinct for hope, that capacity to believe things we haven't seen, that persuades me that the work we do is not work that will be forgotten. The work we do will lead this country to a place and time when no one is executed, when no one is strapped into a gurney, when no one is put in a gas chamber, when no one is put in an electric chair. And that day will come. I'm persuaded of it. But it won't come if we don't keep fighting. It is challenging to do what many of us do. But I am persuaded that justice requires it. I sometimes go to the river near where my office is. It's where thousands of enslaved people were trafficked during the mid-19th century. And I'll sometimes sit and look at that river, and I'll think about my great-grandparents who were enslaved. I'll think about the agony. I'll think about all of those challenges. And sometimes when I'm sitting there, it will almost sound as if I can hear the enslaved being moved, and it's a painful sound. We are doing work around lynching sites, and we're collecting soil at these sites, and we're putting up markers. And sometimes when you go to these sites, if you sit quietly, it almost sounds like you can hear the trauma and terror of the mobs gathering around these condemned people. I remember growing up in segregation and the pain and anguish that my parents would express when they had to deal with the humiliation of Jim Crow. Those signs that said white and colored, they weren't directions, they were assaults. They created real injuries, and I remember the agony of that. I go into jails and prisons, I go to death row, and sometimes I hear the anguish of the condemned and the incarcerated. But when I am really thinking about what must be done, when I'm sitting by that river sometimes, those sounds of agony and pain of the trafficked and the enslaved, those sounds of pain and horror of the lynched, the sounds of humiliation and degradation of the segregated, the sounds of desperation in jails and prisons, they begin to evolve. And before I know it, those sounds are not cries and anguish, they are chants of keep fighting. They are exhortations to the rest of us to stand even when people say, sit down, to speak even when people say, be quiet. And that's my message to all of you. We have to keep fighting. And if we fight, we shall overcome. Justice will prevail. There will be a time in this country where no one will face the death penalty. And because of the work that you are doing, that time is closer than many think. Thank you for recognizing my contribution to this work. Thank you for doing what you do, and just keep fighting.